Well, good afternoon, and thank you all again for joining us today. As Eric said, I'm Audrey Wolfe. I'm the Collections and Education Manager at the Freeport Historical Society. And it is my pleasure to speak with you once again at the annual meeting, more about what we've done this past year in research and more of what we're going to be doing. Like Eric mentioned, we, like many historical societies and organizations across the country, are participating in the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, called Revolution, or Rev 250. Now, I do want to admit that we picked this topic years ago, before the current political moment has brought some of those revolutionary themes back into the public discourse. But I think that timing is worth noting. With my time with the Historical Society, I've been struck that every time something big or small happens in the world, we inevitably get a call from someone saying, well, what do you know about this? How has Freeport handled this before? And the answer is almost always, it's complicated. So let's talk about that complication first. Let's talk about how we've grounded other celebrations focused on 1776. Then we'll take a look at our exhibitions for the upcoming year. We'll mention some of the new insights we've gleaned along the way. And finally, we won't just be talking about history, we'll be experiencing it. Music was vital to the life of 18th century people. And we're going to ask you to join in, be brave, and join us on a few of these historic tunes tonight. You have the lyrics in your handout, and I will not be leading you in song. I'm going to let Eric and Jan do that, so don't worry, you will be in good hands. So let's begin. When the nation hit its 100th anniversary in 1876, we were just 11 years out of the Civil War and in a deep economic recession. One of the ways in which we tried to heal those wounds was holding a massive centennial exhibition in Philadelphia, specifically to highlight industrial progress, which you can see here, what this is showing. But people from the South would note that it mostly highlighted northern industrial progress. So it didn't quite heal all wounds. Still, crowds were introduced to such things like prototypes of the telephone and typewriter, and even the torch of the Statue of Liberty. I love this dress here because I think it shows that we have always loved branded content and souvenirs. This is a dress made out of the centennial handkerchiefs that they sold at the event. The 1876 celebration was also heavily focused on characters. Liberty and Uncle Sam and the founding fathers treated less like historical figures and more like icons, and no one got this treatment more than George Washington. Here he is blessing the marriage of Liberty and Uncle Sam. The 1970s were a similar stressful era marked by the Vietnam War and Watergate and economic stagnation. But the bicentennial also featured an upsurge of grassroots history, local history, and funding for local history, and widening the narrative lens beyond the founding fathers. The era was marked by the rise of bicentennial chic, and for historical societies like ours, the two most common items donated to us was one, anything that could be crocheted, and probably a few things that should not have been. And the number one object that we were donated several times was spinning wheels. These past anniversaries remind us that commemorations are less about the past, and they're more about the present. They're mirrors. Different generations use them to renegotiate their identity, their values, and their conflicts. And conflicts and protest have always been part of the story. On July 4th, 1876, Susan B. Anthony charged down the aisle of Independence Hall in Philadelphia. She and her fellow suffragettes had been denied a booth at the main exhibition. She interrupted a reading of the Declaration of Independence to read the Declaration of the Rights of Women instead. The protest highlighted for them the hypocrisy of celebrating liberty when more than half of the nation was denied the right to vote. For them, they argued that women were living under a government that they had not consented to, much like the original grievances of 1776. The bicentennial featured intense fighting on who owned the memory of the revolution. Groups like the People's Bicentennial Commission protested the corporate and commercial focus of the official events, which annoyed the politicians and the companies who felt like they owned the commemorations. And how did Freeport celebrate? We did what we did best. We put on a parade. I mention all of this not to be cynical, but instead to give us permission to embrace the complications and opportunities that these celebrations hold, and to let you know a little bit of how we've approached the work this year. When tackling topics like this, we like to start with what we already know, what we've already researched, not so much as the foundation from which to do our work, but how to understand how our own organization has participated in historical memory making. Our work last year on the Pettingill property validated this approach, honoring what we knew or what we thought we knew, while also starting fresh. So as a reminder, as Eric said, this is how we talked about that property's history for 49 years. And this is how we tell that story now. Starting fresh gained our community so many more stories and people to add to the narrative. So what did we know? What have we said about Freeport in the Revolution? Practically nothing. Even trying to find a list of veterans was challenging, and when you could find a list, they often disagreed with one another. When I went to the file folder, so helpfully titled Freeport in the Revolution, there were only 2 pieces of paper in the file folder. One was a list of veterans with more than 1/3 of the names crossed out for whatever reason. And the second was a list of books a volunteer had consulted, mostly secondary sources, with the ultimate finding note of Freeport, part of North Yarmouth. Nothing happened here. For this year, it wasn't so much about starting fresh, but starting. But I think it's those efforts that have really paid off for our exhibitions this year. As I mentioned before, we only had 42 veterans, only somewhat reliably identified as either having lived in Freeport or having been from Freeport to serve. And now we add over 98 names to that list for a total of 140. We went through 160 pension records, literally thousands of documents. And in there, we not only gained their first-hand stories of living here and their time in the war, but also 106 new family members, new family connections, people we either didn't know anything about or knew very little about. And also, as part of this work, we processed 3 of our own collections. All of that work informs the exhibitions at the FHS for the next year, one of which is Flashpoints, and the other is The Flames Kindled, Freeport and the War for Independence. In Flashpoints, we'll take you from 1750 to the fall of 1775. We'll look at the moments that tipped settlers towards independence and what our connection is to some infamous events. Among others, you'll meet people like Abraham Mitchell, a 7 years war veteran whose account book we have, and what our connection is to the oldest surviving military vessel in the United States. And we will let you hear directly from the inhabitants of 1774 about whether or not they'll participate in protests, boycotts, and what they think about separating from Britain is. In The Flame is Kindled, we'll take you from the burning of Falmouth, now Portland, in 1775, through the course of the war and into the community that Freeport will become. You'll learn about some of the major battles and how they touched Freeporters, but the exhibition will also introduce you to those the revolutionary narratives left out, the women, the children, and the elderly who stayed at home, keeping the community alive during some pretty desperate conditions. You'll meet soldiers like James McCormick, a not quite convicted murderer, and his ties to Benedict Arnold. You'll hear from veterans and their families directly through their pension and veteran testimonies. And you'll learn more about how our community changed after the war ended, who was set up to thrive here, and who, like Richard Jewell, a Black and Indigenous veteran, was not. Now, working in this time period does have a few challenges. I've mentioned already our own lack of research. And the other big hang-up is that resources are scattered. A lot of them are in Massachusetts, Maine being part of Massachusetts at the time, and some of them in North Yarmouth, as Freeport had not set off from North Yarmouth until 1789. The other challenge is that exhibits are also not books on the walls. So really only a small fraction of what we've learned can ever make it into the exhibition, which is why programs like this and the programs that we'll put on this year are especially vital. Visually, we have an issue, and that it's a lot of beige. As an experience, this time period is notoriously difficult to convey because the medium that survives, paper and faded ink, does not do the people of the 18th century justice in terms of the color and vibrancy that their life held. And just as we often don't think about what their life would have looked like in terms of color, we don't think about it in terms of smell and texture and sound, which is how we've decided to help bring you closer into the 18th century. Throughout the exhibition, we will have period-appropriate and researched music that will help tell the story as you go through the exhibition. Now, during this era, music was rarely for passive listening. It was almost always connected to something active, whether that was social, spiritual, or political. And in the exhibition, you'll hear examples of all of these. The first three we'll talk about a little bit right now, and sacred music we'll come back to at the end. In the exhibition, you'll hear broadside ballads, which were lyrics printed on cheap sheets of paper, usually sold for a penny at the corner, and they never were really printed with music. They were only printed with the lyrics and indicated what was called a common tune, like Greensleeves, that everyone already knew. And the topics ran the gamut. These are examples of narrative or storytelling ballads or morality ballads. This one on your right here is The Ship Carpenter, which is sort of the adventure of the life at sea. And the other is, and forgive me, this is from 1755, this is not me, about why you should never trust a lawyer. By the 1750s and 1760s, broadsides became the primary vehicle for protest and political satire. They even allowed the illiterate to participate in the growing revolutionary movement through song. These examples here are of the Boston Massacre, a song for that, and the one over here is for, it's called the Liberty Song, which was the anthem of the Sons of Liberty that they would sing before every meeting. Now, during the war, the broadside ballads were heavily focused on manliness, how to be a man, and mocking whoever was losing at the time. This example on the left here is actually a Maine soldier's orderly book in which he jotted down several of the tunes that were sung in camp over the years, and all of them pretty unfavorable to women. In the exhibit, you will also hear examples of military and work songs and folk songs. The fife and drum were not for entertainment. They were essential communication tools used to signal movements, wake soldiers up, and regulate the rhythm of marching. Work songs like she shanties and spinning songs and harvest songs synchronized physical labor while also making the work more efficient and safer. This example here is actually really fascinating. This is a sketch of the Battle of Bunker Hill done by British General Henry Clinton, and he made that sketch on the back of a folk song. This folk and work song, John Barleycorn, is an English of Scottish origin and was almost 200 years old by the time that he sketched it on the back. John Barleycorn is a celebration of barley, but is mostly a celebration of the beer that is made from it. Pretty typical for a military encampment. Now, one song you actually will not hear in the exhibit, it was actually the most popular song of the Revolutionary era, and that is Yankee Doodle. While the painting here is most known as The Spirit of 76, when it debuted at the 1876 centennial, it was titled Yankee Doodle. Like almost all of these songs, we don't know exactly who came up with the song or the lyrics. Because the song was a common tune, so again, one of those tunes that was so ubiquitous that people could make lyrics up on the fly, there isn't one Yankee Doodle at the time. Still, we do know that the shell of the song was created by the British during the 7 Years' War. So the British are coming over to the colonies, meeting their counterparts for the very first time, and they are, quite frankly, shocked. They are shocked by how disorganized and how shabbily dressed the colonial Yankee militias are. The lyrics on the left here are generally considered the original, or at least the 1750, 1760 version of the song, and the broadside is from 1770, and it more or less is considered what was standard to sing at that time. That song is from the point of view of a country bumpkin going to a military camp for the very first time. In either case, Yankee Doodle Dandy was a triple insult. Yankee being a term of derision for the British, for the Americans, doodle being a fool or simpleton, or even a vulgar slang term, which I will let you ponder on, and dandy being someone who was overly concerned with how they looked or dressed, a further mocking insult to the Americans who were not. So it started out as a British insult, but it became American. Because as the Americans started winning in the 1770s, they started to sing it back to the British. They started to taunt them with it, mainly saying, well, if we are so simple and backwards, why are we winning? So it is one thing to read a 250-year-old insult. It's another thing to actually sing it the way the troops did. So this is the moment. We've arrived. Grab your handouts. And let's see how this sounded when the American soldiers sang it back at the British after a victory. So I am going to let Eric and Jan take it away here.
This is not a performance, this is everyone collectively, just to be clear. Jan's going to do a little introduction, and then we'll start.
Wonderful. So the current lyrics with ponies and feathers and macaronis that we all learned growing up actually wasn't put into print until 1842. So it was inevitably sang before then, but that's the first traceable moment of those lyrics. And we know it was probably used earlier because of these two sketches. So on the left here is a sketch from 1778 that an American graver working in London made of Yankee Doodle, or the American Satan, mockingly pairing that look of a serious-looking young man with the tune that would suggest otherwise. And on the right is a cartoon of a father literally poking fun of his son, who had become a macaroni. The Macaroni Club was a group of young elite men known for their extreme European fashions, particularly French and Italian. So for decades after the Revolution, Yankee Doodle was the official, unofficial, patriotic anthem of the United States until 1931, when the Star-Spangled Banner became the national anthem. So you will not hear Yankee Doodle in the exhibition, but you will hear the second most popular song of the Revolution, and that is Chester. I told you before that we would return back to sacred music and its place in the American Revolution. And that's because in the 1770s, something really interesting starts happening in New England's congregational churches. Sacred music becomes politicized. And that is in large thanks to this man, William Billings of Boston, a tanner by profession, an elected hog catcher, a failed literary writer and editor, a snuff addict, a bombastic singer, a Sons of Liberty member, and America's first composer. And he has a pretty wonderful connection to Freeport that we'll talk about here in a minute. Born in 1746 to a poor Boston family, he leaves any formal schooling by the age of 14, which is when his father dies. He takes up the work of tanning, which is the profession that he will have for his entire life. Now, tanning is notoriously physical, grueling, awful work. Tan yards are almost always required to be at the outskirts of town due to their noxious smell. And since tanning was actually seasonal work, Billings took on odd jobs throughout the year, for Boston specifically, like street cleaning or hog catching. Now, contemporaries describe a man of unforgettable appearance and demeanor. He was blind in one eye, he had a withered arm, he had legs of two mismatched sizes, and he simply did not care what he looked like. And he was one of these people that when you asked him to please sing or talk softer, he talked louder. And yet, despite having no formal or very little music education, Billings became America's first truly professional composer. And what do we mean by American composer? What do historians mean by that? Well, generally, have to have all three. You're born in America, you make your own lyrics, and you make your own songs. And remember, like I said, those tunes that people were singing were common tunes, pretty much up until this point, transplanted from Europe. You would get lots of different songs, but it was the lyrics that were changing, not so much the music. Over his prolific career, Billings produced 6 tune books and over 300 original sacred compositions. Before Billings and the regular singing music, which is what it was called, congregational churches practiced the usual way, which is called lining out. And what that meant is that someone would stand here and would read or chant a single line back to the congregation, and the congregation would echo it back to them. And because everyone sang at their own pace, everyone sang at their own tune, everyone sang at their own pitch, it made a dissonant sound that critics of the town simply called, and I quote, weird. Billings' push for singing was singing by rule, reading musical notation, replacing the slow, uncoordinated chanting with unified rhythmic timing. The regular method of singing we know was actually here by 1765 because of our church records. And the records show the adoption of Dr. Isaac Watts, who in England pushed for hymns of human composure, which replaced the strict word-for-word biblical translations. Billings took this idea of human-made and made it distinctly American. I don't think myself confined to any rules for composition laid down by any that went before me. He believed that nature was the best dictator, and his compositions frequently violated the standard harmonic theory of European music. As for content, it's Billings' distinctly American mindset that made his work so revolutionary. His first publication in 1770 was the New England Palm Singer, which was the first published collection of entirely American-composed music. Billings was, like I said, a member of the Sons of Liberty and fiercely patriotic. His friend, Paul Revere, not only made this drawing and engraving, but also did all of the drawings and engravings for the music in the book. Billings radically merged devotional songs with the American independence movement. He treated the Bible as raw material, rewriting scripture to cast the Americans as God's chosen people and the British as the tyrannical oppressors. And we know that Billings' work becomes incredibly popular thanks in parts to letters and church records that show that his music is supplanting what was there before. Now, I do want to underscore this, because by law in the 18th century, you were required to go to church on the Lord's Day, unless you had a necessary excuse, it was called. And in Massachusetts, and therefore Maine, the Congregational Church was the standing church, which meant that you had to support the church and its upkeep through taxes, whether you wanted to or not. So think about yourself as an 18th century individual. Let's say that you happen to avoid music most of the time, right? After all, not everyone goes to taverns, not everyone does the same work, not everyone is in the militia, but you went to church, which means that hearing Billings' pro-American hymnals became the ultimate propaganda tool for independence-minded churches and towns. In his famous anthem Chester, he replaced the traditional religious themes with a highly partisan declaration that it was specifically New England's God that forever reigns. Now, this here is the only verse of this song that he produced in 1770, which is what we're going to sing here in a moment. But you might know the other verses as well, which are verses that he did in 1778. He added on to it as the Americans started having victories. But first, to fully and really understand how effective this music is as a political tool, we have to hear it. And so this is, once again, I'm going to ask you to be brave. And you have the handouts, and we have it up here on the screen. This one's short, and I'm going to hand it over to Eric and Jan.
So we are going to sing, just as Audrey said, that first verse, which was published in 1770. Jan's going to play it through once, and I just want to underscore what Audrey said, which was that William Billings felt no compunction to stay within any sense of musical theory. So I have been trying to learn this for weeks, and it's still a challenge for me. So good luck.
Believe it or not, that was better than the usual way that they used to have. So, what's Billings' connection to Freeport? This is one of those research moments as a historian that gives you goosebumps. And also, unfortunately, is one of those things that will never make it into an exhibition. As you may surmise, Billings as a person, and Billings and for his music is well studied. There are lots of books, lots of journal articles about him. But for all that we know about him, only one single letter of his is known to exist. And that one single letter is from him to Asa Lewis of North Yarmouth, and it's about his time here. I mentioned that tanning was a seasonal business. And so in between doing that work and going to Sons of Liberty meetings and hog catching, Billings ran singing schools. To sing Billings' complex music, as you have experienced, communities needed trained singers, which led to the explosion of singing schools at the time. Singing masters would go town to town and hold classes several times a week and many months in one location. And while the official goal of the schools was religious and musical education, it just so happened to also be the very first time there was evening a secular reason for men and women to mingle. And as these trained singers graduated, they were seated together in the choir, effectively giving birth to the first volunteer church choir. And that is how Billings gets here. This is this letter here. This is the only letter we have of his. Over the fall and early winter of 1780, we hired William Billings to run a singing school. He was likely hired by prominent local patriots Jeremiah Dummer Powell and John Lewis, Aza's father, whom he met in Massachusetts while petitioning for copyright protections for his works, and those two men sat on that committee. The letter features several wonderful highlights. It is short, but there's some really good ones here. It features the borrowing and the wearing out of Asa Lewis's coat, which William Billings was so embarrassed that he had run to the ground that he didn't want to give it back to him. There's the hint that William Billings is employing the Lewis family as their roles as land agents, and it's the procurement of some of the raw material that he needed for tanning, bark and wood. Timber and its byproducts are by far Maine's still #1 export. And for Billings, this trip probably had the added bonus of being able to procure those raw materials firsthand rather than having to go through a third party. And it's that wooden bark that we get the hint of what Freeport specifically was up to during the Revolution. If you will send my bark at Talbot's and my wood at Stout's Point, I will reward you handsomely. Even these few lines in a letter give us precious insight into how Freeport was operating during the Revolution. By 1780, Freeport was in a significantly better position to undertake this type of business than before. For one, travel between Casco Bay and Boston was generally considered safe, in large part because the war at that time had moved to the south. And since the destruction of Portland in 1775, other areas rose up to take those opportunity costs away from Portland while they were still rebuilding. Now, we knew that these factors would be things that would launch Freeport into its shipping and shipbuilding era after the Revolution. But what we didn't quite know, and what this helps show, is just how much this was happening during the course of the Revolution. It's laying the groundwork for the Freeport that will become. We also happen to know that Billings' instruction here was effective because our church records by 1783 show that the choir was fighting with each other. They have fought about how they should order themselves, that they couldn't just kick each other out of the choir if they wanted to, and they actually had to be elected by a committee. Now, William Billings' story has a bittersweet end. Although Billings enjoyed a rather prosperous time during the Revolution, by the 1790s, he has declined spectacularly. He died in poverty in 1800 and is buried in an unmarked grave in Boston Common. So, Freeport, part of North Yarmouth. Nothing happened here. We know that that could not be further than the truth. Our efforts that you have supported have recovered hundreds of people back into the community narrative. And those efforts connect you directly firsthand with people's voices, and they can tell you directly what it was like to live here during that time. For me, the story that emerges is less about a quiet settlement waiting for history to happen to it, but instead a vibrant, complicated community, navigating the realities of war and laying the groundwork for the community that Freeport would become. And we know that there are more stories waiting. So before we close, be brave once again with me, and let's experience that piece of history together exactly as Freeporters would have in the 18th century. And let's make our own form of commemoration again. Let's sing all verses of Chester. Or maybe not all verses? The director says yes.
Let's
Excellent, that's great. Excellent. How did you do? Good. Thank you, Audrey. Um, Once again, as I mentioned before, what Audrey is bringing to this work and what she's able to find in terms of increasing both the depth and the breadth of our understanding of many different time periods in Freeport's history is truly remarkable. And I encourage you to ask any questions you have as we move to the reception. So thank you very much for being here today, and we will see you in the other room in just a moment. Thank you.